Hey everyone, welcome back to the NeuroHealth broadcast. I'm your host, Dr. Joe, and today we are joined by our guest, Dr. Dominic Fetterly of the NeuroLIFE Institute in Marietta, Georgia. This was a great episode where we talk about movement, the brain, and how the two are connected. Some key takeaways that I think you're really going to enjoy from this episode is how much is enough movement for the brain? How do we keep movement new and fun and unique to benefit our brains? And then also we'll talk about how much is too much, and where do we need to maybe draw the line. So we'll get into a lot of different topics surrounding movement as it relates to the brain. And Dr. Fetterly is just an expert when it comes to brain health, and I really enjoyed speaking with him today. So, after a quick announcement, we're going to get right into it with movement and the brain with Dr. Dominic Fetterly. This podcast is brought to you by Delta NeuroHealth, located in Columbus, Ohio, where non-invasive, personalized care is revolutionizing the way we approach complex neurological issues. With cutting-edge techniques in functional neurology, functional medicine, and chiropractic care, we're leading the way in managing conditions like concussion, dizziness, brain fog, anxiety, POTS, attention, and more. To learn more, visit our website at deltaneurohealth.com. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today we are joined by our guest, Dr. Dominic Fetterly of NeuroLIFE Institute. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So we are going to be talking about a very fundamental and foundational topic, and that is movement and how it relates to the brain. Okay, so I'm very excited to dive deep into this topic with you. Before we get too deep into that topic, though, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself, your story, and how you got into the world of neuroscience?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Dr. Dominic Fetterly. I'm currently the director at the NeuroLIFE Institute at Life University, as Dr. Kappas said. And, I actually was, lived with Dr. Kappas going through school, and we had the chance to learn all this great stuff. But prior to that, even, I've had history of concussion where I've had enough head injuries that most people kind of flinch at when I mention. When I say I've had over 10 concussions, most people say, "Ooh, like I thought 2 or 3 was bad." And in reality, after about the 2 or 3 mark is when I first started getting symptoms. So I started noticing that, my skin was really bad off. I didn't know what was wrong, but also my memory was really poor. At 15, 16 years old, I noticed that I would drive somewhere and I would, be in the middle of the road, and then I would forget where I was and what I was doing. So I had to pull over and try to reconvene and see what the heck was going on. And it's a really creepy feeling. And then going to medical doctors and conventional, traditional treatment for that type of thing hadn't quite existed, I should say. And most of it was, well, rest it off, go in a dark room. And at this point, we know now that's fairly negligent to just rest in a dark room for 2 weeks. I mean, you're almost causing more damage by not utilizing receptors of the brain. So I look back and I see what my management looked like, and almost not on purpose, but the disregard that was provided for people like myself. And, when I found or learned a little bit about chiropractic and also chiropractic neurology or functional neurology, that's where I really started to see a lot of potential. And oh my gosh, had I had that during the time when I was going through, that would have saved me 5, 6, 7 years of being told, rest in a dark room, wait for it to go away. I kind of accidentally stumbled upon some health answers, meaning exercise, eating right, sleeping right, hydrating, stress reduction, all these things. But I didn't have a doctor to tell me that. It was just kind of trial and error. So fortunately, I had the opportunity to have access to a healthy enough lifestyle that I was able to get back on track. Just mixing and matching the right things come to find out there's practitioners who are actually using those and implementing those strategies. So I thought that'd be amazing to be that. That's where we got to learn a lot of really great stuff and learn more about the brain and the nervous system and how to take care of it. And that's where I've been since. And I continue learning and trying to find new ways to implement strategies, and mostly to look back and say neglected community of people who really weren't able to get care or necessarily get optimal treatment at the time. Yeah.
I think there's a little bit of kind of beautiful poetry in your story, and that maybe during the time when your symptoms were the highest, and it was kind of scary that you didn't know where you were in the middle of the road, which is
Yeah.
pretty frightening.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
that's something you think, 90 years old that you start to
right.
experience. And then for most practitioners to say, oh, it should just go away. And when it doesn't, it kind of invalidates, how you feel about it. You think, okay, well,
Right.
it's not away. So now what?
Yeah. But
Yeah.
at least I think the silver lining of your story, especially, is that you were able to kind of recognize that there was a
Mm.
problem in yourself and in the system, and then you're actually able to uh, you were able to go down a path where you can now make the system better and make people who were in your shoes make their situations better, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. It's exciting to be able to see that. And I think personally for me, again, I love seeing, and I'm sure as you do, because I get to touch base with you. I have a great opportunity to be in colleagues with you that you share some stories with me too, and it's motivating. But having the opportunity to experience and share with other people who have had concussions, a lot of times I can describe symptoms from a little bit of a different perspective, which I think some people are grateful for, just because it is really weird. It's a weird time. I mean, I know from your history as well. You likely have a very similar experience with those patients.
Yeah, and I think it just resonates with people a little bit more when you can share your story with them, and it's like, yes, I've been through that,
Mm,
and this is what I did to take care of it, and now I'm on the other side.
yeah.
So let's just do the same for you now. Get you there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So today we're talking about something that, maybe people don't typically think of with the brain for
Sure.
whatever reason, but movement and the brain. Why are those two so interconnected and related?
Yeah. So, I had a teacher when I was in athletic training school that really brought up this novel, to me, at least, idea that I've kind of carried through as time goes. He described a muscle as an endocrine organ. And I was thinking, like, that doesn't make any sense. Endocrine organs are really slow acting. It works with hormones, it works with blood sugar. It's a really lifespan thing. And then I got to thinking, like, well, why wouldn't it classify as a endocrine organ? Because when we make a muscle contraction, it does regulate blood sugar to the point where, again, so I'm going to describe it in this way, and I tell this to patients and colleagues all the time. Brains are really creepy. They freak me out a little because they're so smart in ways that we don't need to keep track of, which is amazing. But something as simple as a muscle contraction or going for a walk. So I use these GLUT4 mediators, these very specific receptors and mediators that'll pull blood sugar in to change my blood sugar. So something as simple as a muscle contraction can help me from getting a toxic amount of sugar in my blood. And then going forward, not only does that make an immediate change, but long term, your brain gets better at monitoring those things. So I think a lot of times people look at the musculoskeletal system and they don't necessarily tag on the word neuro with it, the neuromusculoskeletal system. So with that, we can exercise and do these things and be great. But in reality, your brain is learning a process in that too. And often it's a metabolic process. So, I mean, if we just sit at rest, for example, and you and I, we're sitting here and having this conversation, we exert what gets considered in literature, one MET, or metabolic equivalency of task. That gives us an amount of energy that we expend and also what our baseline is. Well, just by standing up, we increase that to about 1.5. If we go for a walk, we go to about 3 to 3.5. So with that being said, the difference between sitting and us just resting and talking like this, we cycle through blood and oxygen to our entire body, a whole circuit, 5 liters of blood. In fact, we go about 1 minute per cycle. And then if we were to stand and walk and move around a little bit, we increase that by approximately 6 times. So just something as simple as increasing your MET to be walking versus sitting actually sends a lot of blood flow, a lot of oxygen, a lot of vital nutrients, but pushing through those muscular channels of squishing the blood vessels. And I know, like I said, it sounds creepy, but you squish the blood vessels, you make them go to the hands, the feet, but also the brain. So we think about things that are far away from us, like our hands and feet, they get really cold sometimes and poor circulation. But in reality, when we look at things like that, we think about the brain too. So if we're not pushing blood flow in the areas we want to, in the hands and feet pretty easily, we'll think, we've got gravity to work against for the brain. So things like oxygen, things like all these vital resources that we need the blood flow to go there. And the muscular system is a really great way to do it. So just from even if we say a cardiovascular standpoint that nourishes brain and nervous system, that in itself, I think, is a really incredible way to give everybody access to really great tools for brain health. If we look back, and I think this is kind of a nerdy thing. I actually really enjoy some textbooks. So Guyton and Hall, you remember our big neurophysiology textbook,
Oh, yeah.
big one, or I don't know, it's probably changed a million times. I know you've probably delved into that as well, but I've been looking at it and, creating some PowerPoints, and it's actually pretty incredible. It just makes me kind of sit in awe of what the body can do. And honestly, those authors, and this isn't a plug, like Guyton and Hall don't incentivize me by plugging their book or anything, but they do a pretty good job of explaining it in a conversational way. So for a book that's 1,000 pages long, they make it actually a fairly relatively easy read. But they talk about in there too is there really isn't a cell that's much further, or there's very rare and very few cells that are much further than 50 micrometers from actual nerve or blood vessels. So a capillary itself. So knowing that we need nourishment from these capillaries, and nearly all of our cells are within extremely close proximity, what's one way that we can deliver the blood flow to where we need it to? And of course, movement is a really good way to do it. But it almost sounds cliche, some people say, well, exercise, diet, all these things. And it's yeah, there's a reason these things have been tried and true. But in reality, knowing that it actually doesn't typically take as much as what people think to provide neurological benefits. I know for myself, I've had a waxing and waning relationship with types of exercise. And I think that's actually healthy. I think that's okay, but depending on your goals and all. But in reality, I think that maintaining something is important. And if you look to, these different organizations, like World Health Organization, these things like that, they make recommendations, right? Is they say typically they're going to want people to get between age dependent. Kids get a little more. They want about 420 minutes per week of exercise. And that's typically moderate exercise. Beyond 18, we get into 150 to 300 minutes of moderate exercise. So that's you're still able to kind of hold a conversation, but you might have to breathe a little bit differently. And then if you go more vigorous, where it's really affecting your conversational abilities, 75 to 100 minutes. And you can mix and match those two. There's tons of, these measuring devices, whether it be a Whoop or, I watch. As you can tell, I'm not very technologically savvy. Garmin watches, all these things, but they keep track of a lot of the stuff for you in terms of heart rate and movement and all this stuff. So there's a lot of ability for us to be able to measure and actually tell what this is, instead of thinking arbitrarily, I wonder if I got my 100 minutes a day or a week or anything like that. So in reality, what that translates to in just basic plain language is, approximately 20 minutes a day of just a brisk walk can be enough actually to boost our brain to degrees that almost no medication has the ability to do. Better than, in literature at least, better than any antidepressant on the market, which again, I'm not discounting the fact of the use of antidepressants or anything like that, but as something that can help us get back to a natural state. And even in conjunction with those, I think exercise is one of those things, and in even low level, gentle things that people like, those are the ways to get to it, as opposed to forcing yourself to go to the gym, although that has benefit. I think that's like a diet. If you're trying to deprive yourself of a certain thing for a certain amount of time, you're going to indulge on the thing immediately following that. So I think creating a process that you enjoy as opposed to hate is important. Like for me, I actually typically I don't like running at all. That's not my choice exercise. But my dog loves running. So what I'll do is, I'll take my dog for a run every once in a while, and that makes it feel better for me for some reason. So I create a better connection to exercise in that way. Is if I take the dog for a run, it's helpful for our dog. It gets energy out, but also it makes her behave better. So in my mind, I'm like, oh, this is for my dog, but it's also helpful for me too. So there's other ways, and boxing recently. I've been doing a lot of boxing, and I really love that. It's a lot of fun. It's a technique. You use your mind. Not boxing with people. I don't want to get hit. I don't want to hit anybody. I don't even want to really squish a bug that's too big. But in reality, having something that's new and challenging and having some technique to it, or just letting yourself sit back, relax, listen to a podcast, listen to some music you like, let it decompress, but keep a good pace. A lot of good ways to get that blood flow, get that oxygen, get those nutrients without necessarily having to be an Olympic level athlete or somebody who is training for an event necessarily. For those who do, that's awesome. But for those who don't, I think there's actually a lot of benefit to just starting somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. And something that I want to highlight from what you were saying about your dog actually is that if you take your dog for the run, she behaves better. Right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
what's the relationship between behavior and movement, right?
Yeah. So when we look at behavior and movement, and actually, so we've done at Life University, we actually are just wrapping up, and we're presenting at ACC RAC next year, is the connection of balance and coordination with mood and movement. And what we're finding is as people have better balance and coordination, we have better mood and movement patterns. So with that being said, we look at something like increased movement. We increase the blood flow to the parts of the brain that require the most metabolic activation. So meaning if the brain is this economy, the parts of the brain that require the most cash flow or the most expenditure, the frontal lobe and the cerebellum. There's pieces mixed in there and a lot of other stuff with the brain, with the basal ganglia, but the frontal lobe, the initiation of the movement, the ability to see and contextualize things, as well as the cerebellum, the balance and coordinator. So typically the ABCs of the cerebellum are accuracy, balance, and coordination. So those two work hand in hand. And when we look at the frontal lobe and we also look at the initiation of movement, a lot of times we can connect into this idea. And I know this gets to be maybe a little weird and kind of far out, but it's becoming less far out, which is good. As mental health becomes less cliche as well, is we look at the ability of the brain to move through space, and we call it dysmetria or dysmetria. But there's also such a thing as dysmetria of thought too. So when we challenge those parts of the brain and we bring more blood flow to them, we're actually activating very similar or same networks that are required in terms of balancing our thoughts and emotions too. So when we have a calmer, better ability to access those parts of the brain, the frontal lobe and the cerebellum, and we get better nourishment and blood flow and oxygenation, what happens then is we get a better job of controlling all the other stuff, all the really primitive stuff, all the things that are fight or flight, and keeping us essentially alert to the point where is everything a threat in my environment? So knowing that movement is something that is also nourishing to those parts of the brain, it's huge. It's like, how could we be lucky? How could we be any luckier knowing that we could go for a walk and get all these benefits? But of course, there are alternatives even to just walking. Like I said, if people hate walking, find another way to move. That's okay. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of different activities we can do that can be more fun, that are functional. And I think that's the cool thing. And that's why I say something like boxing, something that requires a little bit of cognitive processing and organizing.
Yeah. And I think that's a good segue into my next question, because we've kind of established that, you want to get at least 20 minutes of brisk walking a day or the equivalent, right? So what can be said about the novelty of movement? Especially, we talked about how metabolically active the cerebellum is, and we know the cerebellum and the brain in general love novelty. So,
Yeah.
what can be said about, maybe, getting to that 20 minutes a day is great, but then, when do we need to start to mix things up?
Yeah. And so I say 20 minutes a day as a baseline measure. If you're doing that, you're doing, gosh, just as good as near anybody. But if we want to go, if we consider it good, better, best, is if we add a little bit of high intensity mixed in there with something. And what I mean with that, because we have, again, it's crazy to think of all the variability that exists within the brain's neurochemistry. But we have these molecules, for example, inside the lining of our blood vessels that they get activated with an increase in heart rate and a little bit of increase in blood pressure called nitric oxide. That what they do is they also expand blood vessels a little bit more, and they also help clean the blood vessels too. So there is something to aerobic exercise, which is that conversational pace and low and slow and just getting some blood flow going, but increasing it a little bit and just pushing yourself a little more actually activates different networks that are pretty good for cleaning the cardiovascular system, but activated through these networks that we don't even have to think about. We don't have to think about, oh, I'm going to go for a cardiovascular clean session, or no, not really. It's we just go for a little bit faster of a run and challenging ourselves a little bit, just to the point where you can feel your heart beating pretty quick and that you need to catch your breath a little bit. So there is benefit to doing multiple types as well as learning a new task, right? So there's a lot of really fun ways that you can challenge the frontal lobe, but one of them is learning a new skill or a game or a task. And with that, you're adding even another layer to it. So and that's what I'll do a lot of times is whether it's going to the gym or these like free apps. So for my example and how I use it a lot and how I recommend for patients, there's these free apps all the time. And you'd think this was like a paid sponsorship of like all these different groups, but I just think they're good. Is, Nike, Adidas, there's other boxing type apps that you can download for free on your phone, and they'll give you variable exercises depending on what you're looking for. If you try mild, moderate, or super intense, you can vary your exercise and you can have a bunch of them from people that train and teach you how to do them. So learning a new task and being able to take a command and learn what to do next and try to reproduce it, that's a really good brain exercise too. So I think from intensity level as well as type of exercise and what you're actually doing is worth varying. So another really good technique that I've learned over the years, and I encourage patients to do this and just to find things that are important to them and particularly that help them in their daily life or helps them build towards something bigger. Ones that I've done and recommended for people is each month to create a goal of something that you work towards. Like this month for me, for example, I had mentioned I don't particularly like running. So I've been doing a mile a day with our dog, walk or run. And from there, every single day this month, we cover a mile that's very intentional. And depending on what our energy levels are, and I say our because sometimes my dog doesn't want to run a mile. So I'll walk, that's okay. It's more for my dog than me, but it helps me too. Mm-hmm. So with that, I think that, for example, this month we're doing a mile. Previous month we did push-ups. And then the month before that, it was a plank for 3 minutes a day. So varying it so that our brain looks forward to something and gets a reward. There's networks for reward in our brain too. So to have something that has no end in sight, that can be a little difficult for some. So again, variability can be fun. Consistency there's value to that for sure. But when we go forward is having a mix of all of it. That's, I think, the real answer for longevity in reality too.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to exercise, I've always had a little bit, I guess I'm a big runner. I've had a little bit of different mindset when it comes to running, and that it's always been, I need to get X number of miles in a week. Like I got to put my nose to the grindstone, just get through it, even if I don't particularly want to that day or enjoy it. And then something recently, I guess within the past couple of years, my wife loves to dance. So we've been doing dance classes and practicing dancing, and we're learning different styles. And I'm like, oh, that's not a workout. Like I got to make sure I get my workout in, like even on the days that we're dancing.
Uh-huh.
And then I'll look down at my watch and I'm like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, we've been here for an hour, 2 hours, and I've done like 5,000 steps or something. I'm
Yeah.
like, this is
Yeah.
like running 3 miles.
That's just it. And also, and that's the thing that caught me by surprise and why I like sharing this message too is, a 20-minute walk a day. Most people think of it as, oh, I do that no matter what. And most people don't. I mean, depending on the research, and it's all over the place in terms of the average. Some people, who get the watches and stuff like that, they think, oh, I get, 10,000 steps a day and I'm healthy. There's actually a book that I think perhaps you've read too, is called Brain Rules by John Medina. And he suggests that we walk 12 miles a day to just maintain our cardiovascular system. So with that being said, we look back at, well, what's the average? 10,000 steps. Well, that's about 5 miles. And that's not the average even. That's what people aim for. So with that being said, average, I believe, is between 1 and 3 miles a day. We walk to our car, we walk to the grocery store, out of our car, we walk back to the car, we walk into the house, and that's kind of it. So knowing that we are pretty severely lagging with the amount of activity, having fun with it, I think is important because it encourages you to do it more. Otherwise, you get into the rut of repeating it and just hating it. So with that being said, it's funny thinking about what's normal, what's average, what's healthy. I think those are all different things. And when we look at what's normal, unfortunately, normal is for people passing away at a fairly young age of cardiovascular disease. I don't want to be normal if that's the case. So maybe we aim a little bit above that and aim for healthy. I don't think that's unreasonable for us to have the standard, especially, as doctors that are helping people and helping them through their health, is to aim for a standard that's healthy. And if we end up with pretty good, pretty healthy, that's awesome. But it's almost like the Harvard of healthcare, if we want to call it that, is we have a little bit of a finer comb or a grading scale that we want to make sure we look from a preventative standpoint. But also when something's happening, maybe we look at different things too. And I know you see this a lot in your clinic too. And I think it's wonderful. I think this whole profession in itself of chiropractic neurology gets to be a lot of fun because I think that's the whole thing, is we're looking at things that most people, most professions don't really know to look at quite a lot yet, like the eyes, like head positions, like body positions, like movement patterns. But it plays a big role. And the things that nourish a lot of those too are general activation, movement, so that they can be governed correctly.
And I'm glad you brought up movement patterns, because going back to what I was mentioning with, my mindset with running is just, miles and miles and miles of linear movement, right? But then I add in dance all of a sudden, and now we're doing like all these like transverse movements and side to side and things like that my body's just not used to moving in. So when you look at repetitive exercise over and over again, I noticed in myself that I was, very weak in like a sagittal plane or transverse plane. So what can be said about, I guess, injury or just general poor mobility in different planes if you're kind of sticking to one thing?
No, I think that's a perfect question, meaning when we look at movement patterns, when we look at what's normal and let's say standard customary, we look at like a forward and backwards movement as like our normal plane. That's what's called the sagittal plane, like you're saying. And for a lot of us, we're more so going forward, meaning sinking down a little bit. So with that being said, that's a sign that we see with, babies, but we also see it with the elderly. And we see them going into more what's called flexion. So they're going more forward, more towards the ground. So there's a few ways and theories as to how we fix that, right? Because, years ago, there was there's an article, and I'm sure maybe you saw this too. I think maybe we talked about it, was there was kids that were growing horns on the back of their head. And what they say that is there's these osteophytic or like these calcium deposits or bone deposits that were on the back of their skull that people were saying, oh, they're developing bones on the back of their head. That's crazy. And they're calling them horns kind of playfully. But what they were calling it was text neck, right? As people were looking down and just consistently looking down at their phone, and they say, oh, they're creating calcium in areas because of the position. And Again, I don't know that I completely agree with that. Like the whole text neck thing, I think I appreciate the sentiment is to be more social with everybody, to be a part of your environment, to be more present. But reading isn't something that we just learned how to do. So prior to technology, people would read books, people would read newspapers, people would still look down. But the difference is that they would get up and do something about it. So they would read something and then they would go find food from the grocery store and they would walk there, or they would walk further distances to achieve point A or point B. So in reality, again, if we say good, better, best, if we were to say that movement in general is pretty good, and then better from there is also being able to navigate in the different planes. So side to side movement is something that we don't use a whole lot. And oftentimes, and again, there's a lot of reasons and fun neurology that goes with it. We can nerd out all day about this stuff, but a coronal plane movement, or let's say a line, if we put our arms out like making a snow angel and we go up and down like a jumping jack, that's coronal plane movement. Moving in that plane and side to side baselines and lunges and things like that are really good for the frontal lobe. That's something that challenges those stability networks so we don't collapse forward or backwards. So I would say for a lot of people, and something that's often lacking is extension-based exercises, things that make them taller, and also things that make them wider in space. So side to side, as well as back and up. The extensors in our body are things like our glutes, our quads, and also when we stand up nice and tall, the back of our upper part of the shoulders, as well as the back part of our neck. So with those being activated, this really cool process happens to keep us from going more in towards our body. And there's also, you look to an example of Parkinson's. Parkinson's, a lot of their exercises are make big movements, but the idea is create a pattern that your brain recognizes that isn't fetal position, because the more fetal position, the more cannonball you go, the more that your body recognizes it needs to protect itself. It's falling backwards. I can't actually get going forward. So being able to be upright and tall and nice and big and wide with movements, there's a lot of benefit to that too. And I'm sure you've learned that with dancing too, with your wife, is they put you guys through a range of things. I'm not much of a dancer, at least maybe not yet. But with that being said, you get a lot of variability in it. So I think that there is a lot of value to being able to challenge different movement patterns instead of just that front and back, focus on wide and tall.
Yeah, which I think is where how you're saying you're boxing now, but a lot of martial arts kind of incorporates a lot of similar movement patterns. You have to move around in different planes, kind of like dancing. So
yeah,
so I could beat you in a dance battle, and you could beat me in a actual fight.
We won't have to ever put that to the challenge, but we'll stick to the dance battle if anything. I think that'd be fun.
Yeah, there we go. On the flip side, this probably relates to a smaller percentage of the population, but when does it become problematic that people are moving too much?
Yeah, so when movement patterns are inappropriate, that's one way. Again, we think good, better, best, but we don't want to necessarily create bad movement patterns, meaning, and that's what I mean, the sentiment behind like a text neck of going into flexion, 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 making the cannonball, making yourself smaller. Like you think about it as like the gym bro that only does like pecs and biceps. I don't think that's really so healthy for the brain. And actually I could defend that pretty consistently. Or, you think about it, we think about as movement as something like actually getting up, but we actually have small amounts that happen when we're sitting down too. I think for us, being able to stand up makes a big difference in brain health. Just the fact that we're pushing more blood flow is good. And again, if we start to train bad movement patterns, that's where we start to kind of deteriorate a little bit. But for like blanketly, I would typically say good movement is good. Healthy movement is good. Bad movement is still sometimes better than no movement, but bad movement is still bad movement, right? And in that cannonball position in particular, or to the point where we're overtraining. We have some friends and patients and things like that they beat themselves up so much, and it almost becomes an addiction in a way, to where they don't ever have a chance to recover. But that's why I say is having a healthy relationship to movement is a good thing. And sometimes it takes a while to build that, and that's okay. But, training for, 4 hours a day and totally grinding yourself up and destroying your joints, I'm this is my personal opinion, not a professional opinion necessarily, not yet, at least, because I've never run a marathon, but that sounds like torture to me. It sounds horrible. And I know
Yeah.
it's great for cardiovascular health, but, long-term marathoners, there is a lot of benefit that comes from that, of course. It's hard for me to rationalize the training process as well as the grueling expense, the repetition that it takes. Not that I think any movement is good. Bad movements are better than no movement. But we don't want to necessarily train something that your body is having to tear itself apart or go into more flexion, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost like a bell curve when it comes to duration and intensity. You don't want to be at the left end of the bell curve, and you don't want to be all the way at the right end of the bell curve. You want to find it somewhere right in the middle,
Yeah.
that healthy zone.
Yeah.
But you can definitely overdo it. And like you said, marathoning or even ultra marathoning,
Oh,
those
yeah.
are great personal accomplishments.
Yeah.
But is it at the end of the day something that's making you healthier? That's debatable.
And that's what I say is, I hate to discourage people from moving and doing
Hmm.
things they enjoy and that they love, because I think that adds a lot of longevity and years to our lives. But with that being said, from a musculoskeletal standpoint, from a neurological standpoint, there's some pieces that I could probably make the argument against that much. But again, I would pick the marathon runner over the couch potato, right?
Yeah.
So there's a middle ground for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Um, and then bringing it back to how this conversation started, we talked about concussion and how you were recommended to sit in a room for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people with concussion, a lot of people with neurological injury have a hard time in general moving or doing physical activity or being out in the world,
Yeah.
or maybe they are physically unable post-stroke, things like
Sure.
that. What would you recommend to these individuals to progressively get to that kind of sweet spot?
Oh, absolutely. So first of all, I would say, if somebody's had something where there was an injury or something that's kept them from being able to do something that they enjoy, call Dr. Kappas, but in reality, that's a great option, and meaning that you can create goals together and you can work towards them with them. Or somebody like me, if you're in the Georgia area, Ohio, you get Ohio, and all the other areas too. We got a lot of people in Atlanta. Oh my gosh, there's so many. But so with that being said, starting small, doing little bits, and actually a lot of times what can be really helpful too is if we can get into the right mindset and do some meditations or do a guided mental imagery of that task of something that's healthy, we actually prime the brain for being able to do some of those going forward too. For example, there's this commonly cited research article about people who had learned to play the piano via actually practicing the piano, visually watching somebody play the piano. And they had the other group, they had them who visually watched the person play. They had them perform that in their head over and over and over. And then they compared them out about a week and a half or 2 weeks later, and they found their skill level was actually pretty similar. And for some people who have had an injury, again, to start that process is getting the muscles moving, even in a seated position, or challenging or marching in place, doing small things and increasing the metabolic equivalency of task can be really, really good. But even visualizing, making those movements at least gets the brain ready to be able to perform those to support healthier habits going forward too.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, no, well said. And it's just a lot of times you need to, like I said, meet the person where they're at. There's
Yeah.
always some way you can move. If you can't stand, you can always do the hand bike thing.
Yeah.
If you can't move your arms, you can always walk. If your heart rate or your blood pressure can't handle being upright, you can do things on your back, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So there's always a modification that can be made.
Yeah.
So yeah. So Dr. Fetterly, we've talked about a lot of great things, great general uh, tips and ideas surrounding movement in the brain. Do you have anything that people can, or I mean, we've taken a lot of things that people can implement today, but are
Yeah.
there any maybe specific things that they can do, actionable steps that they can do right after listening to this to
Yeah,
test
so
it?
I think a fun way to just see where you're at and knowing that it can change is I actually come across an article fairly recently about a test called a sit and rise test. So what you do is you cross one leg over the other when you're standing, and then you go down into what's considered a Taylor sit or a crisscross applesauce, as some may know. And then
Taylor Swift?
Taylor, yeah, Taylor Swift or Taylor sit. So into that cross leg position. And then from there, trying to find a way to stand back up without using your hands. And there's actually a point system and a grading system that you could look up when you go into the sit and rise test. And if you Google it, but with that, it's a pretty good measure of, do you have hip mobility? Is your balance adequate enough? Do you have strength that's appropriate enough in the right areas to get you back up off the ground? And if not, that's something that you could take inventory of and say, oh, well, maybe I'm not where I should be. Because when we look at things like hip fractures, the statistics are actually kind of scary for older folks, where if they fracture their hip and they go to the hospital, a lot of times it's a pretty hard way to get out of there. So in reality, knowing that if we are able to move well, that helps a lot of things, to the point where actually the article that I came across, they mentioned a term called all cause morbidity. So they say basically passing away for any reason. Actually, they found that in the populations that aren't really able to do this test very well, they actually have an increased likelihood of passing away for any cause. So to say that something like poor balance, poor muscle strength, poor ability to move and get yourself out of situations and to maneuver well actually can put you at a likelihood of increasing injury risk and things like that too. So that could be a good one that everybody could just try. And again, if you notice that you're not where you'd like to be, or you have to grab onto the wall or have something nearby you that you push up with your hands a little bit, that's okay, because there are things that you can work on to help that. But that's where I would say, find your local chiropractor, find your local Dr. Kappas, and they'll help you through that so that you can become healthier and make sure that your balance is more adequate, as well as the muscle strength and the patterning of the activation for what you need for you to be able to be stable and strong and move better through space.
Yeah. And that's something we didn't dive too deeply into in this particular episode, but how important balance is to cognitive health and aging.
Yeah.
Very, very important. So there's some really good correlation between how long you can stand on one leg versus how likely you are to have some type of cognitive decline. So,
Yeah.
um, no, this has been excellent so far, Dr. Federley.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of this knowledge with our audience. If you were to leave them with one kind of parting piece of advice or wisdom, what might that be?
Yeah. So I think that, especially with the idea in mind that movement is something that we all want. Perfect is the enemy of good. It's actually something you shared with me quite a while ago. And I think that's worth keeping in mind, is starting somewhere and knowing that you can improve upon that, as opposed to necessarily thinking that it has to be all there right now. And just starting somewhere, and start that with your health journey and maintenance. Maintenance is important. If we don't have somebody who's taking care of us, whether it's a doctor we trust or a therapist, make sure that we get one on our team so that we can actually utilize the team to help us in our own way. A healthcare team is the way to go, and getting people that are looking at everything and measuring everything and making sure that we're good so we don't have to worry about it. That's always nice to have.
Mhm. And in the, I don't know if there are any Ted Lasso fans out there, but in the immortal words of Danny Rojas, football is life, but movement, I would say, is life.
There you go.
So I
That's perfect.
had to plug Ted Lasso at some point in
Yeah, he's
this.
not. They're not very popular these days, so I think they need the advertising. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Figured I'd help him out.
Yeah.
Little known show.
Right. Hmm.
But yeah, this has been great. How can people find out more about you, your clinic, and what you're doing?
Yeah. So Our clinic is called the NeuroLIFE Institute. You can find us at the neurolifeinstitute.com. There is apparently what's called a link tree somewhere in there. We have YouTube videos that we have short informational things that we've done over the past. We also have a couple podcast interview sessions as well with some professionals at Life University and things like that, called the NeuroLIFE Skills podcast. We're looking to build that out a little more, but there's a few on there if you want to get started. And then also, like I said, we're in Marietta, Georgia, on Life University's campus. What I would say is, for students, for doctors, we put together courses all the time. I'm sure if you pass through, say hello to me, but you'll more than likely see me at some point, one time or another, on the campus. I'm always at all the events and everything like that. And also, I help with a course for chiropractors and practitioners with Dr. Michael Longear, called the 100-hour Applied Clinical Neuroscience course, where essentially we go through, for a practicing chiropractor and practitioners, what are the basics, what are the fundamentals of functional neurology and applied clinical neuroscience, and how do we use that immediately in practice. So I help teach those, the live modules too, and it gets to be a lot of fun interacting with everybody and getting to meet people and see what everybody's doing.
Yeah, and I can attest to that. I know a lot of students who have been personally touched or better by, let me say that again, that sounded weird. And I can attest to that. I know a number of students that I've met who have been personally taught or assisted or helped by you in some way. So you're doing such good work down there, helping patients, helping students. So yeah, I know our practice, or our field, really appreciates what you do, Dr. Fetterly.
Well, I appreciate you too. You're doing good work, and I've had the chance to talk to you over the years, and I'm happy and proud of what you have in your area and what you offer to your community as well.
I appreciate that. Well, from your host at the Neuro Health broadcast, take care.